Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community, and a number of people have awared me that there is this continued back and forth happening between Eric Kanevsky and Greg Doucette. Now before we get started, let me go ahead and give you guys that Kanevsky imitation that you guys love so much. Hey everybody, it's Eric Kanevsky here, the most optimal cycler in history. I'm so optimal with my drug doses that I'm only 23, but I look like I'm 45. Alright, but on to the point. So let me go ahead and put on my +5 hat of speechcraft. And let's talk about this. Alright guys, this started off with Eric kind of making a response video to Greg having discussed his cycle, and he basically threw some stuff out saying, well look, you need to understand that it's kind of silly for people to compete natural, and I've made so much progress blasting 9 grams of gear and using 20 units of growth hormone that I've made more progress than you did between your first and your last natural show. And also you're giving me a hard time about my conditioning. And by the way, I hate guys when bodybuilders use that word conditioning. You guys need to stop that stupid shit. Your body fat is not what conditioning means. But, bodybuilders gonna bodybuild. Saying that, well, you can't claim that was this many weeks out. It's a muscle maturity difference, and you just can't expect younger competitors to come in doing this. You couldn't expect me to diet another 4 weeks longer. I'm the leanest I'd ever been. And so on and so forth. And then he went on to say that, look, there's nothing wrong with the doses I'm using or the combinations I'm using. And then Greg kind of came in and responded, and he proceeded to school him. Part of the problem he gave him is that, number one, that he got way too fat. Right? Greg went on him and said, look, the reason that you still look like you're 4 weeks out is that you got way too fat in the off season. How can you expect to get lean enough in X number of weeks when you ballooned up to over 300 pounds and then you cut down to like 220, right? You can't do that. You can't let yourself get that fat, that you overfed, you got over fat. And that's the other thing that he pointed out, is that Eric was saying that he didn't want to use any orals for all of his cycle because it would limit the amount of food he could eat, and then he couldn't get big enough. And you guys already know my stance on that one. A guy like that, if they're going to push the bleeding edge and they're going to put all this stuff into their body to literally say something like, well, I couldn't consume anadrol, which is, in terms of just putting straight up muscle on people, the anadrol is kind of hard to beat. It's kind of hard to beat. And for those curious, that's Larry Wheels' favorite admitted substance, right? I don't think anyone says Larry Wheels isn't jack, strong, lean, any of that. He's admitted that's kind of his go-to. That's his favorite. That he's saying that he couldn't consume this stuff because it suppresses appetite too much, and then he couldn't force feed himself enough. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous, because part of Eric's problem is that he bloated himself up too much, way too much water weight gain, way too much body fat gain, and then had to cut down, so he lost muscle. So essentially, had he put his body into a better, more favorable anabolic environment and actually trained correctly on top of just using drugs, because he doesn't really train. Eric doesn't train. Eric goes in and plays around on some fluff and pump exercises. He doesn't train. That he didn't put on enough quality size because of that, and then he had to diet down too much. He ended up losing everything. He lost all his leg size. Like, Eric had no legs left or anything else by the time he dieted down for this bodybuilding stuff. And I'm saying that objectively. I'm sorry, I come from the strength world, not bodybuilding world, and he had small legs. Like, even for a strength athlete, for a power lifter, he would have had small legs, right? It's because he doesn't lift heavy. He doesn't really train his legs. He plays on some machines for high reps. And I'm not saying that can't have its place, but it can't be your primary training stimulus. But that's what he told him, is that, well, you're concerned that something is going to limit your appetite. Well, that would have been a good thing because you over bulked. And even as Greg said, if you're at a point to where you were having to force feed, to gain muscle, there's something wrong. And I would tend to agree with that. And I'm even coming from a background as a guy who gets fat really easy. Right? I've never had to force feed myself to even get fat. But this is Greg coming from even a physique type background of saying that, look, you shouldn't have to force feed. If you're doing that, all you're probably doing at that point is gaining excessive body fat, not extra muscle. And it would be one thing if your goal is to just get as big as possible. But when you guys are talking about going and doing some sort of stuff to where you have to cut later, or you have to get down to a certain body fat or a certain body weight afterwards, yeah, you can't force feed yourself till you just get really, really fat. Because when you diet down later, you're going to add time to your dieting. And if you add time to your dieting time, that's less time that you get to actually spend getting bigger and stronger. If you're having to do it just to reach the number, and that's the smaller part. The bigger part is that if you get too fat, in order to keep that muscle, you have to diet slower. You have to diet much, much slower. You put on an extra 10 pounds of body fat more than you intended to put on. In order to preserve the muscle that you gained, you're going to have to reduce the rate at which you cut that body fat later. Otherwise, you're going to lose muscle. So you end up losing any additional muscle that you might have gained. It doesn't make up for it. You end up smaller than you could have been. And Greg brought that point up with him of saying, well, that should have been the least of your worries. It really should. It should have been the least of your worries. One of the other big things that Greg went in on him really hard on, and it's something that I did too, of literally the most moronic thing that Eric has ever said. And let me make this clear, guys. I'm not even against anabolics. Everyone thinks sometimes that I say stuff that I'm telling people that there's no place for people to be enhanced. So there absolutely is. I'm not anti-gear. I'm anti-gear abuse, right? First of all, I don't want people breaking the law. Number two, I don't want them taking unnecessary health risks if they choose to go this route. Because let's be honest, not everything everyone does in this world is healthy, right? McDonald's is not healthy. Smoking weed is not healthy. And if anybody thinks that those things are safer than people who use modest amounts of anabolics, you live in a delusional world, because that's just not the case. And that's not saying that anabolics are completely safe. It's saying that you're underrating how bad smoking weed is for your lungs. You're underrating how bad for your organs and diabetes risk and cardiovascular risk and everything else that eating McDonald's every day is. Like, you're not accepting those realities. So everything's got to be taken that way of you've got to be cautious about it. But the point is, this whole ludicrous idea that he came up with, that you need to just keep adding progressive overload of the substances you're putting in your body, is absolutely insane. That is absolutely insane. And as Greg pointed out, even if you were going to take that route, doing it every 2 weeks, you think that you really adapt to stuff every 2 weeks? I mean, we could make the point that people who want to go on stuff, that maybe on a yearly basis they might need more. In other words, if they started using stuff, they might need to use a little more the second year than the first. On the third year, they might need to use a little more to continue to make progress. On a yearly basis, okay, I can see that. There's some truth to that in many cases. But it doesn't need to be doubling every year. And when you start talking about someone like Eric, who over the course of months is increasing stuff to where he's tripling the amount of stuff he's using inside of 1 year so that he can get progressive overload with the things that he's taking, not only is that absolutely ludicrous and just downright irresponsible, he's telling that to his audience. All right, he's telling that to his audience. And then you got to wonder, because Eric is over here offering coaching services too. Offering coaching services, you got to wonder what he's telling his clients, because Eric doesn't know how to train. He doesn't know how to perform exercises, basic exercises, correctly. He doesn't know how to program anything. He doesn't know anything about periodization. He doesn't know anything about training programming. He clearly doesn't know how to eat correctly. So what is it that he's coaching people on? He's probably coaching them on drug stacks. So if you have a child, a 23-year-old child, who thinks that they know a lot about gear or appropriate usage or safe usage, who's now being people's drug coach, who is saying publicly that people need progressive overload, need to be continually increasing the amount of stuff they're putting into their body, do you understand how reckless and dangerous that is? And here's what I would say to the people listening to Eric when he makes a statement like that. Do you guys understand what an ignoramus he is? Do you understand that he is not only putting his own life at risk with that, but he's putting everyone's life at risk? Let's go back to the point. When I say something like McDonald's is just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than anabolics, If you were to progressively overload your McDonald's intake, well, let's come back over to that point. Do you think it would kill you? In other words, if you said that every 2 weeks you had to increase the amount of McDonald's that you're eating and your calories from McDonald's every 2 weeks, to the point to where you go from, say, eating 2,000 calories of McDonald's a day to 6,000 calories of McDonald's a day, right? Over a course of months. Wouldn't most people look at that and say, that's ludicrous, that's going to give you heart disease and heart attacks and diabetes, that's going to kill you, right? Wouldn't we say that? So why would a person who's telling you with actual hormones and drugs that people are putting into their body that the same concept is even a remotely good idea? It's moronic. And Greg is right to call him on that. I've called him on that. Anyone with any common sense will call him on that. And then you got to wonder, what in the hell is this clown telling his clients? Like, what's he having them put into their bodies? See, that's the scary part. No one cares if Eric overdoses on a bunch of gear and damages himself, right? And I hate to say that. That's really mean to say. That's a really mean thing to say. But is it any big loss? Probably not. It's self-inflicted. He's willfully ignorant. But then when people are paying him for advice and he's telling them to do the same thing, that's a travesty. Then again, I guess someone would argue that, who in the hell is coming to someone like Kanevsky for advice? It's just based upon those things that he said. I just don't get it. But the thing is, it was interesting to see Greg kind of going hard on him again and be honest with him, because Eric probably needs to hear that. Eric's audience probably needs to hear that. And it's a little bit of hard truth. And I might not like everything that Greg does. I might not agree with a lot of the stuff he says. But I think he was more than fair this go around. I think he's more than fair and more than reasonable. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative. And I will talk to you guys next time.